I'm going to segue. All the panelists can stay here and feel free to join in the conversation, but we're going to transition a little bit to talk about Siri's book, which we're very excited about, and copies will be available outside. So when you're mingling, pick up a coaster from the Gender Equality Evidence Hub and pick up a book from Siri. And so I'm happy for the panelists to jump in and ask Siri questions as well. But maybe I'll start with, you're across the latest research and you're constantly engaged with organisations advising them on evidence-based strategies about what works to make work fair. Can you share some of your favourite examples of evidence-based action?
It's a difficult question only because we know so much about what works and what doesn't that it's like you're asking me to pick a favorite among my children. Let me try to give you 3 quick examples from different realms of organizational life. And Leonora and I are spirit sisters also in the sense that we share this passion for action and making evidence not only accessible, but really easy to put into practice and to put into action. So let's talk first about recruitment. My first example to you comes from a large global telecommunications and engineering firm, which employs more than 100,000 people around the world, 75% of them men. And this company's aspiration was to hire more women and also to hire more non-national candidates. So Australians going to work in China or Americans applying for a job in France. And we partnered with them to create a 7-minute video and ran a randomized controlled trial and experiment where some managers were invited to watch this video at the point where they had raised a requisition for an open role on their team. They were going to hire somebody new, but they hadn't yet gained access to the applications to review them. The point of this video was to be very timely and capture the manager's attention at a moment that mattered when they were paying attention. The intention of this video also was to be highly targeted to the hiring decision. So the video featured 3 of the organization's senior leaders, reminding managers of the importance of the hiring decision that they're making, reinforcing the norms of the organization, that they wanted to be a company that reflected the diversity of the societies in which they operate. And they also gave managers a concrete tool to hire differently. They invited managers to think about what skills are present on their teams, but also what skills are missing, and to think about how the new person they hire and bring in could help to round out the collective competence of the team. And in our experiment, we were able to show that the managers who had watched the video had double digits higher shortlisting and hiring of women, non-national candidates, and even higher effects for female non-national candidates, who initially were the by far the least likely group to get hired. So the main lesson here is as we think about trying to shift people's behaviors and make small tweaks to the systems that surround us, right, our everyday ways of working, we should make those interventions really timely and captures people's attention at a moment when they're paying attention, at a moment that matters, and we should make those interventions very targeted to the specific behaviors and decisions that we're trying to shift. So let me share a second example from parental leave take-up and social norms, which I know is also a hot topic here in Australia. This is a study that was run at Santander Bank in the UK, where men working at the bank were surveyed, and 99% of them were warmly in support of flexible work, including parental leave. But they only thought that 65% of their colleagues would be equally supportive. This is an example of a phenomenon in behavioral science called pluralistic ignorance, whereby our perceptions, really, of what other people believe are often miscalibrated. And behavioral science also tells us that what we think other people think shapes our behavior often to a greater degree than what we think in our heart of hearts, which is exactly what we observed in Santander's case. So when some of these men were randomly informed that, actually your colleagues are just as supportive of flexible work as you are, they took significantly longer parental leaves as a result. Not because their personal beliefs about parental leave had changed, but because their social calculation about how a longer leave would be received by their peers had changed. And now that they accurately knew that their peers were equally as supportive, they had less reason to fear social backlash. And maybe one more super quick example about meetings. How many of you spend too much time in meetings? So let's make them better. especially if you're a manager in a position of leadership such that you're meeting with direct reports. A wonderful study from Novartis, the global pharmaceutical company, showed that when managers speak less in meetings and spend more time listening and provide the floor to their employee to raise concerns that are on their mind, challenges, so that the manager can kind of be a thought partner. How can I support you better? It actually ends up leading to more frequency of meetings because the meetings are better and people find more value in them. But it also increases employees' feelings of belonging and psychological safety.
I love this so much. I could listen to your examples for ages, and it's got my mind ticking over about what I can recommend in a certain report that I'm writing. So I will read that book. There are a couple of questions I'm going to ask really quick. Okay, can you give me just maybe one example of something that sounded good in theory, similar to what the Assistant Minister talked about in terms of the babies given to teenage girls? An idea that sounded like a really good idea, but actually wasn't backed up by evidence and evaluation.
The number one thing in this vein is unconscious bias training and diversity training. It is insanely popular around the world. It's been studied for more than half a century, and we have 400 or 500 studies now, really high quality ones, that show that while people often do enjoy the training, they sometimes even learn new things, their behavior doesn't change as a result. So if we want to see real results, if we want outcomes to shift, the data to shift, the way to get there is not through training, but through systemic changes, small tweaks to the processes and ways of working that shape the decisions we make every day.
I love that. Last question for Siri, and thank you for being so succinct. And when did you arrive in Australia?
11 days ago.
Okay, 11 days. So you haven't had that long, but it's been 11 days in Australia, and you've been watching, if you see anything on the news or any Australian news that makes it to the US. We'd love to know what you've observed or what your thoughts are about what's going on in Australia around gender equality research, around policy, around practice, around WGEA, around the Commission for the Public for Gender Equality in the Public Sector. What are some of your observations?
I am genuinely incredibly impressed by three things. The first, of course, is your results in absolute terms, whether we're looking at the pay gap or anything else. The numbers really tell the story of how Australia's long focus, world-leading research, and the strength of the civil society ecosystem in collaboration with the private sector and the public sector is really delivering the real measurable results that we would hope to see. So kudos to everyone on the stage and everyone in the audience and online, because your work really is bearing fruit. The second thing that I'm really impressed with is the sophistication of the ecosystem and really the world-leading policies and practices that are coming out of here. And I knew a little bit about that already because I've been a researcher in this space for more than a decade. A lot of the research and examples that we feature in our book also come from Australia. But as I've had more of these conversations and gotten to know the landscape even better, I'm going to export so many of the practices from here and bring them back to the US and everywhere else that I'm speaking. And the third thing that's really struck me that was a surprise is the total lack of complacency here in Australia. Even though you are doing so well and leading the world in many of the things that you do, there's not a single person that I've spoken to who has said anything but, there's so many problems we need to fix, there's this, we gotta do better on this is the next target. No one's kicking back and saying, well, we're actually doing pretty impressively. We're number 15 in the world. And I think that just speaks to how much potential there is for continued success when we don't rest on our laurels, but we keep raising the bar and just pushing forward.
Thank you. Thank you, Siri. Congratulations on your book. And we're so pleased to have you here. You can continue the conversation with Siri outside. I'm going to do real rapid fire across the rest of the panel. What's one thing that you would like to see evaluated or know more about its effectiveness to have put on the hub? Maybe Matt, I'll start with you.
Yeah, great question. And I think I'd select what doesn't work. I know that's implicitly often there and sometimes explicitly in the conversation about what does work. But I think we all quite naturally have an aversion to sort of discussing and learning from kind of problems and the things that go wrong. I think of, for example, the medical disclosure of errors or near misses in aviation, and so the ability to talk about and have, deal with more evidence on that. And maybe one area where I think maybe that sort of sophistication in conversation is beginning to come out is in some of the work around gender-based violence and disclosures of gender-based violence, which as we get better at responding to disclosures and better person-centered, trauma-informed responses, the numbers of disclosures keep rising. And although it's clearly not a good thing, it is a step towards a good thing. And so being able to have those sort of more sophisticated conversations about data that perhaps on first inspection doesn't look like how you would like it to, and isn't how we would like it to be, but is on a pathway to getting where we'd like it to be.
Yeah, fantastic. Leonora, you probably have a list of 10 things or like 100 things that you want it to be on the hub, but do you want to pick one?
I had to narrow this down. Oh, look, I'm glad Matt and Siri too have pointed out what doesn't work, and part of the motivation for creating the hub is actually to elevate that information. So I did a paper a few years back interrogating this advice for women to lean in and be more confident, because so much effort and so much focus was put towards it, and the research would suggest that no, there's no guaranteed improvement in your job promotion prospects. So, steer towards systemic cultural change. And the example that Siri's given about the limitations and the ineffectiveness of diversity training, in fact, that it can cause harm. It can give people a sense that, I've cleansed myself of my biases now because I've done a 3-hour workshop. So part of it is interrogating the commonly adopted, almost the quick go-to easy fixes that put the onus on the individual to change rather than the harder systemic change that's ultimately more effective in the end. There's one thing I'd really love for researchers and policymakers to evaluate is the impact of gender-responsive budgeting. So this is the economist in me saying when we have processes where we put our budget making cycle through a gender lens to identify the policies that sound gender neutral, like defence spending and infrastructure spending, or that sound like they have nothing to do with gender equality, but do implicitly have some flow-on effect to the gender equality outcomes we care about. We really need to pin that down with data and evaluation and evidence and see where it's been implemented. So we have before and after, we have state variation, we have time variation. It's an awesome research piece in there just waiting to be written.
What am I going to vote for? I'm going to vote for intersectionality and having a greater focus on cultural diversity, culturally diverse women. I'd like to see more flow from, there's incredible community work that goes on with multicultural communities. Like, they are so cutting edge, I feel like, but I don't know whether they have their programs evaluated to feed that back into the system, but they are doing incredible work. So that's what I would love to see. Siri, one thing?
Gender and artificial intelligence.
Okay.
In terms of who's using it, is AI exacerbating or can it close gender gaps? And how might AI be helpful to our gender equality efforts in other spheres?
Yes, love it.
For me, it's industrial and occupational segregation, which is such a big problem in Australia and is, a major factor in the gender pay gap. I think we know a lot, but we haven't brought it all together, and we certainly don't know what individual organisations can do about some of that stuff, and yet it is actually an indicator under the legislation that I oversee. So it's a challenge, I think. I'd love to see more.
I had two thinking someone else would say it, but they haven't. So very quickly, I think working out how we break down the ideal worker norm and the carer norms, getting to the bottom of the stereotypes we have. And I think while we do well on a number of fronts, I think we do have very strong stereotypes about gender roles. And the second one, which is connected to that, is we have spent a lot of time, and not very comprehensively, but been lots of programs about getting women into STEM and women into masculinized industries. I think there's just such a massive gap about whether it is similar or whether it is different about getting men into feminized industries, because they're the growth area. That's where we actually, and it goes back to these caring roles, but in a broader context as well. How do we break down those norms in terms of feminized industries particularly and get more men involved?
Amazing. Thank you. I hope someone was writing them down because they're not all in my head. Can I just ask everyone to thank our panelists? I feel like we could talk for ages about gender equality because we're all incredibly passionate about it. Leonora, do you want to make any final remarks before we wrap? What do you feel like?
Oh, thanks, Stacey. Oh, look, I feel like this has really crystallised so much of the thought and the actions and the work and the efforts that our panellists are invested in and all of you are invested in and online. So just thank you for coming along to share that and be part of it. And I hope that you leave tonight feeling uplifted and a sense of affirmation. You feel heartened that we can consolidate our efforts and harness and amplify what all of us are doing, and that spirit of sharing knowledge and learning from each other and being open about what works and what doesn't work. I really hope that's the takeaway that you feel, and that you feel like you can be part of that community of sharing, and that you'll come and use the hub, and you'll discover things you didn't know before, and you'll be able to share it onwards. You'll be able to share it maybe with a family member or a colleague or your boss or a volunteer group, and people will feel empowered. Knowledge is power, and we can turn knowledge into action when we share it and we distribute it and put it in the hands of people who can do something with that knowledge. But we can all be portals and part of the transmission and elevation of that knowledge, so it's not drowned out by other competing interests, but it's driven by that core purpose of making our culture far more gender equitable and inclusive for everyone.
Thank you, Leonora. Thank you to all of the panelists. Thank you to all of the speakers. Thank you to all of the people who have helped set up and run today. Thank you to Samir, Sean, Philip, Gemma, Maria, Kerry, Lena, Mark, Ben. Please forgive me if I have not mentioned your name, but there's a whole raft of people that have helped put on today.
And a big thank you to Stacey.
Thank you everyone for coming. Thank you everybody online. Go forth and check out the hub after this, and I hope everybody can join, well, everyone here in person can join us for some drinks and refreshments outside.
Make sure you pick up your coaster. Thank you for coming. Thank you.